Ready to get back into Jeremiah? All right, well, before our break, we were talking about the main sins that God is addressing in his people through Jeremiah, and that was idolatry, corrupt leadership, and social injustice, right? And so I wanted to look a little bit more at these, starting with idolatry. And idolatry, I think, is the hardest one for us to identify with, just because most of us didn't grow up in cultures where people worship physical idols. So for you guys on a daily basis, you're not like, no, okay, there's a statue over there, I'm not gonna bow, I'm not gonna do it. That's probably not a struggle that you've had in your life experience. So sometimes when we read about idolatry in the prophets, it can seem a little bit far removed from us or difficult to relate to. But I just want to talk a little bit about how idolatry is still a major issue in the world today, and also how it is more of an issue than we realize for those of us who don't actually bow down to physical idols, but perhaps we have idols in our hearts. Yeah. So because I've spent most of my time working in the Hindu world, idolatry is a huge thing in Hindu nations. Have any of you guys been to India or Nepal? Yay, I love that so many hands go up for that. So this will be like stuff that's really familiar to you guys. But here's a picture of Kathmandu, and all of these people in Nepal are lined up to go into a temple to worship an idol. And this is part of their daily life. And they worship many, many different idols, and they are trapped in this because they worship the idols to get something that they want or need, whether it's healing, whether it's financial success, whether it's some sort of a higher reincarnation or anything like that. That's why people worship idols, is to get things that they think they need. That's why they're devoted to them. And a lot of these idols that they worship are really dark. Like, this is not a loving God who would sacrifice his own life to bear his own wrath so that you could be saved. You know, and yet in the world there's literally millions of people who are actively worshiping idols today and actively thinking they have to appease these kind of gods in order to have a successful life. Like, a lot of times, like if they feel tormented by demons or if they're sick or something like that, they have to wonder which one of these thousands of gods that are out there, which one did I make mad? And then so they start offering different sacrifices to any ones they think could have made angry. But then if their problems don't stop, they try to start doing it to another god, and it really can impoverish people because they're continually trying to figure out which idols they need to worship in order for bad things to stop happening to them and good things to start happening to them. Also, sorry, these pictures are really graphic, but the book of Jeremiah is also really graphic. But this is called a lingam, and it's supposed to represent the male and female sexual organs. And these are all over in Hindu temples. And that's because sex is something that, in order to have children, or just because of gross sexual practices, a lot of the temples have erotic carvings all over them. But it's very similar to stuff we read about in the Old Testament. We have the Asherah poles. We see that the Israelites are prostituting themselves. So some of that stuff is really literal, and it's still going on in the world today. There's ritual sexual practices that take place in worship of idols in the world that we live in today. So this isn't something that's just of the past. There's many people still bound by idolatry. There's also a lot of sacrifice. This is a water buffalo that I saw being sacrificed in Nepal. And an interesting thing about this animal sacrifice is it was for a police station. So it was to keep the police officers safe or have good luck or something like that they were sacrificing this animal. But thousands and thousands of animals are sacrificed on a daily basis to different idols as part of ongoing idolatry in the world today. This temple here, is kind of like I've already talked about. Have any of you guys been to Pashupati Temple in Nepal? Okay, so you've been in there. I don't know if you guys remember this little temple. It's right when you first walk in. But this temple was originally used for human sacrifice. And by some estimates, there's still human sacrifice that goes on at this little temple after hours. So even if it doesn't happen there, it is happening in other places. And I'm sorry, again, this is graphic, but I just want you guys to know this is going on in the world today. These are some of the carvings on that temple. It's just graphic, gross things that are done to please idols. So to study books like this in a context where people are coming out of these kind of backgrounds, it's very different than for us that come from the Western world where we don't blatantly worship like physical idols. Here's another idol. This guy is like disemboweling somebody. I don't exactly know what's going on, but people worship things like this, thinking that they need to do it in order to get the things they need in life. They're trying to get different things from the gods by worshiping these kind of idols. And as I already talked about, human sacrifice is still happening in the world today as well. Not this particular little girl, but if you just Google child sacrifice in Nepal or India, you'll find that there's newspaper stories with current dates on them where they find out about little girls especially being sacrificed to idols in order to improve people's businesses, in order to increase their wealth and things like that, that children are still sacrificed to idols today, just like we read about in the Old Testament. You guys remember reading about how people sacrifice their children to Molech? Did you guys learn about that last week? Even some of the kings are doing it to their kids. That kind of stuff still goes on in the world today, and people try to appease idols like this to get what they want, whether it's victory over their enemies or financial success. These things still happen. And then I also just wanted to make that a little bit more personal to us, to just think about, even though we don't physically worship idols, we still do worship things to get what we want. And they're just not physical idols. But the reason people do a lot of those, like even the child sacrifice, is for wealth. And I think wealth is a huge idol in non-idol worshiping countries like the United States and many others, where people are completely blinded in their pursuit of wealth, and they'll trample on anything to get to it. They will do corrupt things. They will get involved in partnerships they shouldn't get involved in. They'll step on people. They'll oppress people to get more money and to get ahead because they care about prestige. They care about being impressive. They care about the security that something like money can bring. And so I don't know any of you guys' personal journeys, but money is something that can be an idol in any of our lives. And something that was convicting to me that I heard a sermon on once was just that it's not always wanting to spend lots of money that can be idolatry, but also wanting to save lots of money can be an idolatry. Some people, like, their problem with money means they max out credit cards and buy lots of stuff so people think that they're really impressive and more valuable because of that. But other people, like, hoard their money and aren't generous at all and won't give any of it to anyone or even buy presents for people because their idol is having that money in the bank because that makes them feel valuable and that makes them feel secure. And I've never had credit card debt or anything like that, but I had a real stingy stage growing up where, you know, like Christmas time, buying gifts for my family, like I would get the cheapest thing I could possibly get for people because I wanted that money in my bank account, you know? And so those are just some things to be aware of. I don't know your personal battles with money or your family's battles with money, but people sacrifice a lot because of money. Some of you might have had parents that didn't pay any attention to you because they were too busy working or trying to get more money, you know? And that's idolatry. It's putting something as, this is what gives my life meaning. Having money gives my life meaning, and I will sacrifice whatever I have to sacrifice in order to get what I'm going after. And so that's a very common thing. And another thing there is success. People want to be successful, and sometimes in order to get success, they'll do all sorts of crazy things because they don't think that they are valuable as a person unless they are at the top of their career or the smartest or the most talented, and they have to be successful, and they'll drive themselves because their idol is being successful. And it's not wrong to have money. It's not wrong to be successful, but what's wrong is when that becomes the driving force of your life. That everything revolves around that. It's central to who you are. And then another example too is just power, and that's where I have the guy with the controlling thing. And you see this corrupt even pastors sometimes. where they get so used to, I'm the authority, I'm the expert, people do what I say, I'm the big guy, and that can even lead to their downfall. I think it can even happen in YWAM. Bases can get unhealthy where the leaders control everybody and everything's really about serving the leader and not serving God. Like, there's no one that's exempt from this sort of temptation. And for some people, the idol of power is a big temptation for them. They want to be the person that gets the respect, and they want to be the person who has the say-so. And a desire to do that can become a very dangerous idol in the heart of a person. And then another idol is appearance. For some people, their physical appearance is an idol in their life. And I struggled with this. I struggled with both anorexia and bulimia when I was growing up, because I thought my value was in what I looked like. And I had to do everything I could to look like the girls on the cover of a magazine, because I thought that's what gave me value. And I spent way too much time thinking about scales and what I should eat. And it's not only girls that do this, there's guys too that, inject steroids into themselves to get bigger muscles, or have to be in the gym all the time, or always trying a new protein powder or something. And I'm not saying we shouldn't take care of our physical bodies, but if that's what your thoughts are consumed with all the time, then that becomes an idol in your life. And so I just hope by giving these kind of examples that you guys, when you read about idols are things that we worship to get what we want. And that's what the people in the Old Testament were doing. And these are the type of idols that people in our culture worship to get what we want. And what we want is we want to be meaningful. We want to be acceptable. We want to belong. We want to be important. And in order to feel like that, we end up pandering to these different types of idols. And so as you deal with idols in the prophets, I want you to make that a little bit more personal and just think, what are some things that consume my thoughts? What are some things that consume my attention that have the potential to be an idol in my life? Even if it's not a physical thing that people see, it's what I think about all the time, and it's what I think gives me value. And I think all of us will find that we struggle with these kind of things. Maybe your particular thing isn't up here. There's obviously many other things that can be idols, but it's just something important for us to think about. And along with that, have you guys heard of Timothy Keller? Any of you like Timothy Keller? He's one of my absolute favorite writers and speakers. And he has a book on idolatry called Counterfeit Gods, which I highly recommend. It's like a really short little book. But this is him saying better than I can say why idolatry is important in a little preview that he did for his book.
I'd like to share a bit about why I wrote the book Counterfeit Gods. When many people hear the term idolatry, they immediately think of people bowing down to statues. However, idolatry can be much more than that. That ancient concept has never been more relevant, because idolatry does happen here. It's not only something you do physically, bowing down to statues, it's also a matter of the heart. An idol is anything more fundamental than God to your happiness, meaning in life, or identity. So idols are not bad things, they're really good things turned into ultimate things. Anything can be an idol. So the obvious idols are money, sex, and power. Many of us understand that these idols in our culture are wreaking havoc. So there's too much emphasis on possessions and money, too much emphasis on physical beauty. But if anything can be an idol, then dedication to family can be a problem. You can make an idol out of your family, out of your children, out of your spouse. You can make an idol out of your commitment to your religion. You can look to your moral performance to save you. And therefore, you cannot understand your own heart, and you cannot understand your culture unless you learn how to understand and discern idols. If you are a person who's always wondered, why can't I change? Why can't I really even understand why I do the things I do? I wrote this book for you.
So now you all want to go buy Tim's book, so hopefully he'll give me some royalties or something. No, I'm not interested in that. But did you guys hear some of the things he said? It's anything in your life that you make more important than God. You think is more important to your happiness than God. And it's also, idols are often good things, but you're just making them too important, that you're looking to them to define you, or that's how you make all your decisions is based off of them. And even things like family. There's a lot of people who aren't being obedient to the call of God on their lives because what their family thinks of them is more important to them than what God thinks of them. Whether that's their family wants them to be close to them, or whether that's because their family wants them to have a more financially lucrative career than missions is. But these are things that we have to wrestle with and recognize, who do I belong to? Who do I truly serve? And we want to say God. But a lot of times it can be other things. We could be serving money, or we could be serving our family, or we could be serving our career or success or recognition. And so just keep those things in mind when you go through thinking, idolatry is probably a lot more relevant to you than you might think at first glance. And so what I want to do before we move on is I just want you guys to take a moment, and you can write it down or not write it down, but I want you to just say, God, is there an idol in my life right now that you kind of want to highlight right now? Is there something you want to work on in me, something that's become too important that needs to be put back in its proper place, in its proper perspective? And so why don't you guys just take a second and think about that before the Lord. Well, Father, I just thank you that you're not a silent God, but that when we ask you questions like this, that you're very quick to show us blind spots that we have and to highlight things that need to come into their proper place and allow you to be the one enthroned on our lives higher than anything else, Father. And Lord, just with the different things that you've highlighted during this time, I just pray that you would make yourself larger and larger in our eyes, just like you did with Isaiah when you called him, that everything else just dimmed, and he said, woe is me, as I'm a man of unclean lips, and I live in the midst of people of unclean lips, yet I've seen the glory of the living God. That, Lord, as we get a greater revelation of you, that it would change our perspective on the way we live our lives, our perspective on ourselves, God, and that a greater revelation of you would be what truly changes us. Yeah, and Lord, as we look through these prophets, I pray that we wouldn't just judge the people of the Old Testament as these sinful people and think we're the righteous people. Yes, we have righteousness through your Son, but our hearts too can be full of idols, and we don't want to let those things tear us away from devotion to you. So Lord, we just ask that you would do your work in our lives and just free us from the power of idolatry. In your name, amen. All right, moving on to the next thing, corrupt leadership, the prophet, priest, and king. We don't have these as major authority figures in our lives today because we don't live in Old Testament Judah, but these are still things that I think we need to think about. And there is still corruption, obviously, on government levels, but I think that governments are not, most of them, claiming to follow God, so that's a little bit different. But even within our structure as the church, we can see corruption in church leadership or even missions or YWAM leadership, and even in our own hearts as we interact with people that God gives us authority over in missions. Prophets can still use their prophetic gift to bring themselves glory or to make everyone else think they're super spiritual or to use it as a thing of power in people's lives, or they can prophesy presumptuously and say things that are just their own opinion and what they want and not what God is actually saying. And God takes that kind of stuff really seriously. Also, in our service to God, we want to make sure that anytime we're in a position of leadership, that we lead people in a good example of following God and not in a bad example. And that's a really convicting thing. And it says in the New Testament that teachers are judged with greater strictness. And that's a heavy thing, whether you're a teacher up front or whether you're a teacher of just in a small group setting, or whether you're a teacher within your family. Whoever you are that you're teaching, we don't want to misportray God by living lives that are the opposite of how God has asked us to live, in the choices that we make, in the priorities that we have. We want to make sure that we're submitted to the Lord in the areas of leadership that we may find ourselves in, and that we don't follow the bad example that we find in the Old Testament of those in authority leading the people in doing evil. And so I think we need to submit ourselves under the hand of God as any people who have any position of authority given to us, to just make sure that we are not leading people astray and leading them into wickedness instead of leading them towards godliness. And that can be in some of the things we choose to watch, and some of the things we choose to wear, in the way we control our tongue, in the way we make decisions, the way we treat people of different backgrounds. Like all of those things, we just need to have a seriousness in our heart and realize that God really cares about righteousness in those kind of areas. So as you read condemnation on the prophet, priest, and king, read it in that light. Read it in the light of, could I be somebody who, if I was a leader right now, a lot of you guys are being students right now, so you're not leading something, but God's preparing you for leadership. And you have to be asking yourself, are there things in my life that I would actually lead people astray by right now instead of pointing them towards God? Because if God's going to allow you to step into a position of leading people on any level, then, he's going to expect more of you. And he's going to want you to lead in godliness. And you're going to have to know that he's going to have to do some more refining in you in order for you to be able to do that. And you don't want to be one of those people that you hear the bad stories about, that their downfall is great because they got in a position of leadership and then they blew it really big and just gave such a bad example to God and gave Christianity a bad name. We see examples like that all the time on large and small levels. And so think about that when we deal with that theme. And then finally, the theme of social injustice. And I think this is the most popular theme in the world today. I think even amongst non-believers, social injustice is a big issue. People trying to stop human trafficking or slave wages, factories, getting a big profit off of not paying fair wages. Like all of that kind of stuff is something that there's kind of a spotlight on today. And so we're already kind of aware of that, and I don't think it's as hard for us to identify with this, but I just have another really quick video that just talks about the social injustice we see in the world today, and I just wanted to stimulate your thinking again, that when you read through these prophetic passages, you can keep in mind that these are still relevant issues for today.
We have hardly any grit for this. And most of us wouldn't even want to see this, honestly. Most of us think we're such an enlightened culture. We kill our babies. The poor of the earth are oppressed. We see injustice after injustice. Amsterdam is full of prostitutes. We see women being stolen and trafficked across the earth. We have more slavery today than the earth has ever seen in all of history. It's right now. Injustice reigns on the earth, and Jesus says, I'm girding my sword upon my thigh, and I'm returning to the earth with justice in my heart. The zeal of the Lord of hosts is in my heart. Isaiah 42 says, I have held my peace for a long time, but I'm about to pant, I'm about to gasp, and I'm about to return and bring justice to the nations. And I'm waiting for a people who will stop thinking about their comfort Christianity and say, God, I know I grew up in the West, but bring me out of the West!
It's hard to watch some of that, and I think even looking at, abortion, I just had a baby. It's never been more real to me, just that life is a gift from God. But as much as we condemn these cultures that kill babies to get what they want, I think in a lot of ways, the West is really, really guilty of killing a lot of babies to get what we want. Because those babies get in the way of our idols. They get in the way of careers. They get in the way of our wanting to have sex with whoever we want all the time when we want it. And they get sacrificed because they're not considered valuable, and they get in the way of people's idols. And they're even making themselves their own idols, that they want their life to look a certain way. And so as much as we see this as so barbaric as it happening in other cultures, I really think that, when history looks back on our time, they're going to be appalled, honestly, at the number of babies that were sacrificed to wanting a better career, or it's an inconvenient time, or different things like that are not valid reasons for murder, because that's really what it is. And I think it's things that God will judge our generation for. And I don't know anyone's history or past in here, and I don't want to bring condemnation. I just want to bring conviction before God. And we know that there's no unforgivable sins, and we also know that God is a merciful God. But I think that sometimes we can be so blind to the idols and the weaknesses of our own culture just because we grew up in it. It's so easy, and many of you are not from the United States. And when you come here, I'm sure you see a lot of weaknesses in America that Americans can't see, because it's like fish discovering water. Fish are never going to discover water because they're immersed in it, But as you guys have gone on outreach and will go on more outreaches in the future, you can see the weaknesses in other cultures sometimes when you get there that they can't see because you have a different perspective. But there's no sinless cultures. There's no cultures that don't have idols. There's no cultures that don't have blind spots. And we all need to be brought into submission and under the authority of the Word of God, and make sure that our lives look like Jesus and look like the kingdom of God, and not like just fitting in with the culture around us. And honestly, I think one of the biggest struggles of American Christians is just not wanting to be uncool. And I've faced that myself, sometimes I don't want to say what I truly think about something because I know it's unpopular. And I don't even like the small persecution of somebody just thinking I'm an idiot, or somebody thinking that I'm irrelevant or out of touch. The issue of abortion came up in a family setting not too long ago, and a family member said we were bigots and that we were what was wrong with America, with the views that we held. And that hurt, it was tense and emotional, and I wasn't prepared, and stuff like that. But that's a pretty small kind of persecution compared to what a lot of people face. But even that, we just shirk from it. We run from it. We don't want to look uncool or not politically correct or anything like that. And in our desire to not do that, we can make a lot of compromises, and the desire to be cool or relevant or socially acceptable can actually be an idol in our lives that we compromise for. And I think there's a lot of that going on in the church these days, and it's something that we really need to examine in our hearts. So another thing we want to look through with going through Jeremiah, and I'm kind of touching on it already, but being called in the midst of a wicked generation, and that's the call to suffering and rejection. We have Jeremiah wanting to serve and honor God, and you've seen also this in the other prophets. Yet they're living in a time where no one wants to honor God. No one wants to follow after God. They hate the prophets. They stone them. They persecute them. Jeremiah ends up in the bottom of a well. He ends up in prison. He ends up in the stocks for righteousness' sake. And it's a lot easier to live for God when you're around other people that are living for God. But when you're in the midst of a generation that doesn't want to serve God and follow after God, that's a tougher call. And I honestly think that it's a call most of us have, unless you're called specifically to church ministry, whether it's in your work relationship or within your own family if they're not believers. There's a different value system there. And it's painful to have to suffer even just ill thoughts from other people because of the sake of Christ. But as we go through that, we have to know we follow in the footsteps of many, many other people currently alive in the world today and throughout history that have faced persecution, physical persecution many times, but even just social persecution for following after Jesus. And we need to say, do I care more about being right before God, even if it's painful, Or do I care more about being socially acceptable to those around me? And those are really hard questions to ask ourselves. Like, even when you're sitting next to somebody on a plane and they ask you, oh, why are you flying? How do you answer that? Do you say, oh, I'm a missionary, or I'm going to do biblical training, or something like that? Or do you try to make it sound a little bit more, oh, I work for a nonprofit organization. Yeah, we do a lot of aid work. That's true, but that makes you sound cooler in their eyes. And I'm not saying we can't phrase things in a way that they can identify with, but we should never be doing it to protect ourselves in an ungodly way that compromises who we are, because we don't want people to think we're weird or uncool, or I don't know. I just think it's something we really need to be aware of. And then also, I don't know the calling that God has on all of your lives, and he may ask some of you to go to really hard-hearted places and be a witness for God there, and you might be those type of missionaries where it's really hard to stay because no one's believing your message. He has asked people to do that all throughout time. God loves the lost so much that he'll send his own son into the world, and he didn't get treated very well. He got crucified for coming and bringing the message of salvation. And if that's how the world treated him, it's not out of the realm of possibility that God loves the lost so much today that he might ask you to go and be a witness somewhere for him where it will not be easy and it won't ever get easy. But he wants you there because he loves those people and he wants them to have a chance. And I can pretty much tell you that's not any of your plans for your life, but sometimes God has different plans than we expect. And the Bible's real. It's not just pretend, nice little thing for little verses to stick on your fridge or something like that. Like, these are real issues that we need to wrestle with, and these are real people's lives we're reading about. Like, Jeremiah was a real man. He had hair on his head. He ate. He slept. He had a mom and dad. He was a real guy. And this is what God asked of him. He was just as human as we are. And if God could ask him things like this, we have to acknowledge that he could ask that of us too. And as much as he was worthy of Jeremiah's sacrifice, he's worthy of any sacrifice that he would ask us to make for him as well. And we don't want to be fair weather Christians that are only Christian as long as it works for us, as long as it's easy for us, as long as it's convenient for us, because that's not lordship. We need to recognize that we were bought with a price. And it's not us who lives anymore, but it's Christ that lives in us, and that we want to glorify God during our time here on earth, because we know this isn't our home. We're just passing through. Our citizenship is in heaven, and that's our eternal home, and this is just like a blink of an eye compared to the eternity that we will spend with the Lord. And so many times the world is full of people who tried Christianity, right? But then as soon as it got hard for them or they got mad about God for something, they walk away. That's not lordship. That's not a true encountering of who Jesus is. And we don't want to find ourselves in that crowd of people. We want to make sure our faith in God is based on the truth of who he is from his word and what it really says to follow him. And not just whatever's convenient or whatever's popular or whatever's socially acceptable. So these are good challenges for us to think of in this book. Just some logistical things. The date of the book, I think you guys use the Nelson's maps and charts and the source view. I think it gives you some of this information too. But the dates are during the reigns of Josiah, Jehoahaz, Jehoiakim, Jehoiachin, and Zedekiah, and Jeremiah outlines that at the beginning of the book. And we have a timeline on the wall over here that covers these last kings. These are the final kings of Judah. So these are the last ones before exile. And Jeremiah had a long prophetic career where he prophesied, I think about 40 years. And so we want to, as we interpret his prophecies, know who the king is and what's going on. And this is the downfall of the nation of Judah. It is like headed down the tubes, and he's there to witness the very end. So that's kind of the context we find ourselves in. And along with that, there are contemporary prophets. Zephaniah. Have you guys read these minor prophets yet this week, or is that part of your reading today? Okay, nice. Well, I'll just mention briefly here what they're about. Zephaniah is about the day of the Lord. And the day of the Lord is a time when God acts. So we read about the day of the Lord a lot in the prophets, and sometimes it means the ultimate day of the Lord when God comes at the second coming and the righteous are vindicated and the wicked are judged. But the day of the Lord also is just any other time that God acts, like the time when God acts to take Judah finally into exile is a day of the Lord. And also the time when he brings them back from exile is a time when God acts. It's a day of the Lord. Sorry, my throat's bothering me a little bit. So Zephaniah talks about the importance of that, and how to be hidden on the day of the Lord is to put your hope in God. And so it's the point of the book is that the righteous remnant, those people who are seeking after God, we don't need to fear the day of the Lord because he will hide us on that day. We won't face his judgment. But at the same time, it's a good reminder that the day of the Lord is a real thing. And the book of Zephaniah is a good motivation for evangelism, because we need to realize that, you know, there is going to be an end to this world as we know it, and we don't want to be the people who knew the answer, that had the hope and never shared it with anyone. And God is merciful. He doesn't take any delight in judging people, but he wouldn't be a good God if he just allowed wickedness to go unchecked, and there will be an ultimate day of reckoning. And you're either a friend of God or an enemy of God. There's no other category in which to be. He really wants every single person to be a friend of God. And he's left us here as ambassadors to go and tell people that and give them the opportunity to accept salvation. I mean, God bore his own wrath in Jesus. Like, Jesus was God. So the wages of sin is death, right? And Jesus went to the cross as God and bore God's wrath so that we didn't have to. And that's what he wants to do. He doesn't want to judge anyone. He doesn't want to send anyone to hell. He doesn't want to punish anyone. What he wants them to do is accept Jesus standing in their place and let his wrath fall on him instead of on them. But if people aren't willing to do that, then there's no other recourse. Mercy has been offered. But we need to recognize the seriousness of that. And so as you read Zephaniah, that urgency of, you know, there is wrath of God. And if people aren't going to choose to let Jesus bear it for them, then it will eventually come on them. And that's not God's desire, it's not our desire, but we need to be motivated to preach the gospel so that people can see that. Thanks, Stephen. Then there's the book of Habakkuk. Habakkuk is one of my favorite prophets, and you're going to hear me say that about too many prophets. But Habakkuk is really unique because Habakkuk is a conversation between God and Habakkuk. And so it's similar to Job in the way that Habakkuk's questioning the righteousness of God. Like in most of the prophets, we see God accusing the people of unrighteousness, right? That's what we see. But in the book of Habakkuk, we actually see Habakkuk accusing God of unrighteousness. So that makes it really unique. And basically what he's saying is Habakkuk probably prophesied after the reforms of Josiah. And if you remember, Josiah cleansed the temple. The book of the law was found. He read it to everybody. We'll talk more about that later. But it's probable that Habakkuk was actually a priest or a Levite who should be living off of the tithes that people bring. Now, we all know when the people aren't bringing the tithes, that the Levites and the priests really suffer because they have no way to make a living. Kind of similar to missionaries, right? If no one cares about God, no one's going to support you as a missionary, and then your life stinks. And some of you have experienced that on a personal level during your time in missions, you know? So basically, Habakkuk's saying, Lord, in the covenant you said, if you obey me, I will bless you, and if you disobey me, then you're going to suffer the consequences of that. But I look around me and I see all of the wicked people prospering, and here I am trying to be righteous, and my life's not going well. And so he's basically accusing God about not caring enough about injustice and not caring enough about wickedness. And so God answers him basically and says, I care a lot about wickedness. I may not be doing things on your time frame, but I'm sending the Babylonians to take your nation into exile. And he's like, I just wanted you to deal maybe with some individuals. I didn't want my whole nation to go down. So now instead of accusing God of being like too merciful, now he's saying you're being too unmerciful. And then God just basically says, I see all time, I see all perspective, and all wickedness will be judged, and all righteousness will be rewarded, but you have to trust my timing. And just put your hope in me, and know that even if it doesn't happen in your way, the way you expect it, the way you want it to, I do care and I will act. And he goes on to just talk about that even on a more global scale. So Habakkuk's a really good book for missionaries who are wrestling with lack of support. It's really good to read just when you wonder why the righteous don't seem to be prospering and the wicked do. It just has really good themes like that. And then Obadiah we'll do Daniel and Ezekiel in class, but Obadiah is another one of my favorite prophets. See, there I go again. I had to teach Obadiah one year, and I had to teach it with Habakkuk in SBS, and the only reason I taught it was because I wanted to teach Habakkuk. And God really surprised me out of this book. It's just one chapter. It's like the shortest prophet. And what it is, it's a condemnation on the Edomites, and the Edomites are a neighbor of Israel, and they descend from Esau. And basically, they had a tumultuous relationship with the people of Judah and Israel all throughout their history. But it's a condemnation on them because at the time of Jerusalem's fall, the Edomites rejoiced. And they were like, hoo-hoo, and it shows its progression that at first they're like, ha-ha, look what's happening over there. And then they go a little closer, and then they start actually taking part into the fact where they go in and they take plunder out of Jerusalem, and they even catch captives and give them to Babylon. And so they actively partake in the downfall of their brother, And I think that God really convicted me in that book because we've all had people we've been jealous of before, whether it's a sibling or whether it's a friend, somebody better at sports than you, somebody better looking than you. And when something bad happens to those people, there's part of our heart that wants to gloat, right? Like we're the first one to want to share, oh, did you hear what happened to this person? And think about all those gossipy magazines at the checkout register in the grocery store. Us, weekly, or I don't know. I try to not even look at them, but it'll tell you which stars really have cellulite and whose marriage is really failing and who really got plastic surgery. Why do people want to read that? Because they're jealous of those people and they gloat a little bit over them not being as perfect as they seem. And that's something that can be really deep in our hearts. And I have a sister who's a year younger than me that excelled over me in everything we did growing up. And I had jealousy towards her. And it really hit my heart how, judgment lies with God. But we cannot put ourselves in a place to gloat over somebody else's downfall, and it makes God really mad when we do that. And so Obadiah has a really good message on that. So look for that when you read through Obadiah. And then Daniel and Ezekiel we'll talk about during class. But basically what I want you to see is that God has a lot of prophetic activity going on at this time of the end of his nation. And that's merciful. Like if you guys think, going back to a parenting analogy, if your parents told you to clean your room and you didn't do it, and then they asked you to clean it again, and you didn't do it, and they asked you to clean it again, that's being merciful, right? Because they could have just punished you right away. And the fact that they keep giving you a chance is actually mercy. And even the depressing words we read in the prophet, it's merciful of God to say them. Like if your parents said to you, if you don't clean your room, you can't go to your best friend's birthday party this weekend. You're going to miss out, and you're going to be sitting here at home cleaning your room when you could be out with your friends. Or I'm going to take your phone away from you and ground you from it. Like, saying those things, that's not things the kid would want to hear, right? But it's actually merciful of the parent to spell out for them how bad it's going to be. And the reason a parent would do that is because they actually want the kid to change and go do what they were supposed to do so they don't have to punish them. So as you hear God saying how terrible some of this judgment is going to be, just remember, he could have just judged them. He could have judged them way back in the time of the judges, right? God gave the law in 1446 BC, right? And Jerusalem falls in 586. That's 860 years of second chances. And so when you hear people say, 860 years that God was merciful when the people continually broke the covenant before he sent that judgment that he said he would send, and that was taking them into exile. So when people say, I don't see mercy in the Old Testament, you guys, there's so much mercy in the Old Testament. I don't see how anyone could argue that 860 years was too short of a time to show mercy. And he sent prophets in every generation to give those people a chance. And he had these prophets do insane things. Isaiah walked around naked. I mean, God was into creative learning, right? I mean, he wasn't only reaching the auditory learners. He wanted the visual and the kinesthetic. He's shouting to people, please listen to me. I don't want to do this. So even as the words are ugly to hear, see the mercy of God in the fact that he is shouting so loudly and having the prophets do the most bizarre things to get the people's attention so that he doesn't have to judge them. He doesn't want to do it. But he wouldn't be a good God if he didn't keep his word. And for all the people who suffered under this oppression, all the people who suffered because of idolatry, the children that were sacrificed, what kind of God would he be if he didn't eventually act? So just see that in the prophets. Even as you read those depressing, hard to read words, see that it is the mercy of God, that he keeps warning them, that he keeps giving them chances. And there is mercy in the Old Testament. Anyway, sorry, a little sermon for free there. So anyway, we're at this final downfall where God is finally going to act. And we'll see that as this happens, he's got prophets everywhere. We've got Jeremiah back in the land with the people until the fall. And then the people go into exile in a couple different groups. And we'll go over this actually on this next slide. Actually, it doesn't deal that much with it. I'll go over it more on this timeline. I know you guys can't see the timeline very well because you're a big class, but I'd encourage you to go look at it in the breaks. But there's 3 different times that people went into exile. Are you guys familiar with these exile dates at all? When's the first exile? Well, 722, but that was actually Israel. And so the people of Judah went into exile in Babylon at 3 different times. And so the first time was in 605, and we'll deal with this more as we go through the book. But in 605, they had stopped paying tribute to Babylon. Actually, this is when they started paying tribute to Babylon. They had been paying tribute to Egypt. But anyway, Babylon came down and took they were now the ruling world power, and they took the absolute cream of the crop out of the land and took them to Babylon to enrich the brain of Babylon. It was like a brain drain kind of thing. And Daniel was one of the people who got taken in this exile. And so we're going to study later about him in this week. So now we have a prophetic voice amongst the people that were taken into exile in this first skimming of the cream of the crop that are like in Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar. There's Daniel prophesying to them. And then later in 597, they stop paying tribute to Babylon. And because of that, Babylon comes and attacks again, and he takes Jehoiachin, who was king at that time, into exile. And he also takes 10,000 of the elite people of the land. So this is a bigger brain drain. This is like anyone who has any sort of skill. So like the artisans, the craftsmen, anyone who knew how to do that kind of stuff. He took them into exile at that time, and Ezekiel went with them. And they ended up living in Babylon in a land that was given to them. It was actually a good land. He just wanted them to not rebel. And he said, go live here and prosper. He just wanted them to not rebel, basically. And they had a good life there, and Ezekiel was there prophesying to them. And then back in the land, we have Jeremiah prophesying to the people there. So everywhere where God's people are, he's giving them a prophetic voice and a chance to turn and repent. And that's not even dealing with the minor prophets who are also prophesying at the same time. So God is really trying to get his people's attention, and there's continually even opportunities to repent almost up to the very end that God is wanting people to take. So the exile is measured in different ways, and that's more what this slide shows, because Jeremiah prophesies 2 times that it will be 70 years that they're in exile. But when we take, if they went into exile at 586 and then they return from exile in about 539, that doesn't it doesn't add up to 70 years. So the exile is usually counted from the time 2 different ways. One is when the temple is destroyed to when the people are first going back and rebuilding the temple, and that's about 70 years. You'll deal with this more in the post-exilic weeks. And then also it's measured from the first exile to the first return. So that first people who went in Daniel, with Daniel in 605 to the 539, or I think it says 535 on here. There's a little bit of debate depending which books you read on the date of that. But those kind of give you the measurement of 70 years. So did you guys do a timeline or anything during Kings, or I don't know what you guys do? Yeah, so if you're trying to figure out how did it end up being 70 years when it doesn't look like 70 years, that might help you to understand just a little bit about the passage of time. Does that make sense? Okay, we'll deal more with it later. One other thing I wanted to talk about is the structure of this book. And Jeremiah was not easy on us, or whoever compiled these scrolls together, because the book is in no way in chronological order. And so that doesn't affect you guys too much because you don't have to do much with the structure, but if you do SBS, you'll be very frustrated and scratching your head a lot trying to figure out how these prophecies fit together. And to make things worse, the order that the chapters are in is different in the Hebrew version of the Bible than it is in the Greek Septuagint version. So that even like in trying to figure out the logic behind it, scholars really struggle to find out why it's in that order. And the way I'm going to teach you guys this week is I'm going to teach it in chronological order, and that's what this timeline is over here, is each of those numbers is a number of a chapter, and those are the chapters in chronological order as we go through the book. So chapters 1 to 20 are all during the reign of Josiah. And so before we do those, we'll look more in depth at the reign of Josiah. And then the green are under Jehoiakim, and then the red are under Zedekiah. And then the purple is after the fall of Jerusalem. So we're going to actually go through the text in chronological order because that's what I had to do to understand the book. And so I figured if I needed to do that to understand it, it'd probably be helpful to you guys to know it as we go through too. If you guys want to be extra nerdy Bible students, you can make a little key in the front of your Bible that says Jehoiakim and Josiah and Zedekiah, and then you can go put like little boxes that correspond with the color around those chapters so that when you read each chapter, you know which king that it's under. So I can see the nerdy people are like, yay, and the other people are like, we already read Jeremiah, so. So depending which category you fit in. But yeah, that might be helpful for you. Uh-huh. Yeah, I do have a picture of it, so I can send it to you guys, or you can just take one with your phone too if you want to. But yeah, you can definitely do that. Then you can have it with you when you're reading or studying or something. So, but yeah, anyway, the structure of this book kind of reminds me of the TV show Lost. Did any of you guys watch Lost? Yeah. They're flashing forward and sideways and backwards, and like that's kind of like what it is. You're like, okay, what chapter are we in? Okay, now who was this king and what were they doing? And you have to like continually reorient yourself as you go through. And so I don't know why the book is in the order that it's in, but that's the way that we're going to approach it. So just some unique features of the book, things that you should notice and maybe noticed, but if not, I'll just tell you for your future study of Jeremiah, is it's one of the books in the Old Testament that has the word love or heart in it the most. And if you guys remember when you did Deuteronomy, that book was known as, showing God's heart a lot, and love was repeated in there. But it's repeated more times in Jeremiah. It's 44 times in Jeremiah, and it was 54 times in Jeremiah, and 48 times in Deuteronomy. So even in the midst of all this judgment, there's a lot of talk about the heart of God and how God feels and how much he loves his people. And that's something I don't want you to miss out on. Jeremiah, even all the prophets have a lot of language from Deuteronomy, the restating of the blessings and curses of the covenant to each generation. Jeremiah has even more than normal. There's a really heavy emphasis on language of Deuteronomy. When God talks about judgment, it's talked about in the terms of the covenant. It's famine, it's war, it's defeat, it's barrenness. When he talks about blessing, it's physical blessings like peace in the land and victory over their enemies or being renowned amongst the nations, things like that. It's the terms of the covenant just restated again and again. Another thing is, I already said this, but we know more about Jeremiah than we do about all of the prophets combined. So when we're studying Jeremiah, we want to pay attention to his emotions and his life experiences because it gives us insight not only into him, but what it was like to be a prophet. And we want to have an understanding of that, and that will be helpful for us as we go through. And so there's 6 different passages that are called Jeremiah's Confessions, where he kind of like cries out to God in his distress over his calling, and we're going to look specifically at those as we go through. Also, it's full of beautiful language, and some of the beautiful language is also painful language, but I'm sure you guys have already discovered in going through the prophets, it's descriptive, it's poetic, and it's trying to paint word pictures. And what I'd really encourage you guys to do in reading, even if you're done with Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Daniel and the post-exilic prophets that are still coming, is visualize what they're saying, because these words are supposed to bring up images in your mind. And sometimes the images are really ugly because God's trying to get their attention, whether it's about their idolatry or adultery, things like that. But you want to just pay attention to that poetic language, because it's God being into creative learning and trying to get their attention by the words that he chooses. Also, there's a lot of enacted symbols in this book, and we'll see even more in Ezekiel as well, where these prophets are asked to physically do things to represent the heart of God towards the people. These are visual aids for the people, like Isaiah walking around barefoot and naked. Like, that was a visual aid. It was an enactment. Do you guys remember why Isaiah did that? Pop quiz. Why did Isaiah walk around barefoot and naked?
They're going to be shamed?
They're going to be shamed. Who was going to be shamed? Yeah, good job. A+. Yeah, they were trying to put their hope in Egypt to save them from Assyria, and he's like, this is what's going to happen to the Egyptians, guys. Naked and barefoot, they're going to get led away. Don't think you want to put your hope in that. Put your hope in God, So that was like an enactment to get their attention. It's easy to forget somebody's words, but somebody walking around naked, probably you'll remember. And aren't you glad God didn't call you to do that, or even worse, call your dad to do that, right? Poor Isaiah's kids, right? That's your dad, Yeah, super awkward. Another thing, and we'll look more about this in a little bit, is an important thing, and this will carry over to Ezekiel too, so please observe this when you guys read through Ezekiel, is pay attention to things in quotations, because God, through the prophets, quotes the people back to themselves. And we can learn a lot about the original reader by the things in quotations. Like, they'll say things like, oh, God doesn't hear anymore, he doesn't see anymore, and actually, I don't know if we'll get to it this morning, but we're going to do that on chapter 2. We're going to look at the quotes that the people say, and that will help us to realize a little bit more about who they are. So in both Jeremiah and Ezekiel, pay attention to anything in quotation marks. I like to highlight it in a different color, but you guys do what, I know you don't have very much time in DBS, so you have to keep going really fast. But that's something that can really help you. And I don't think the SourceView Bible does that for you. I really hoped it would, but when I looked, I think they just still put it as God speaking. But that could be something that would be helpful for you guys to look at as you go through. And then who God is and what he says about himself, that's something you really want to observe in pretty much any book. But you see a lot of the beauty of the heart of God when you just take time to observe those different passages and see what does God say about himself? How does he feel? What is he doing? And we never want to miss the heart of God in a book like that. And then lastly, I already said this, but notice the calls to repentance, because they're there all the way up to the end. All right, and here is from archaeology. This has been discovered. It's the seal of Baruch. So I don't know if you guys remembered on your read-through, but Baruch was Jeremiah's scribe who wrote for him. And this is historical evidence of his existence. And it's just always awesome when we see that archaeology is backing up what we already know from the Bible. And they found this seal that is from the scribe Baruch. And so that's just like a cool thing to know about the book of Jeremiah, that this has been found. So lunch here is at 12, right? Is that when class stops? Yeah? Okay, I get confused. Different bases have lunch at different times. But we're going to go into, so we are going to have time to get to this, the original audience. And so, kind of like what we've already talked about, the main people who are hearing Jeremiah's prophecies are rebellious people living in Judah before the fall of Jerusalem. That's the main audience that he's speaking to. And they're hard-hearted and they don't listen, but that's who you want to keep in mind. Also, always, there's the faithful remnant. Like, there's always some people who are still true to the Lord, and so they would be listening and fearing God, but they're not the majority, they're the minority. But God always preserves a faithful remnant. And I think you guys saw that probably in Isaiah repeated again. I'll keep myself a remnant, There were people who were true to the Lord till the end, and through exile as well. So anyway, we're going to go ahead and do that word shop. So if you'll turn back to Jeremiah chapter 2 again, what I want you guys to do is I want you to go through and look at the things in quotations and underline them or mark them just as an example of what you could do for the whole book to help you understand the mindset of the original reader as God quotes them back to themselves. So, like for an example, this is a quote from the past, but if you look at verse 6, it says, "Where's the Lord who brought us out of the land of Egypt, who led us in the wilderness?" You know, there's a quote there, and he's basically saying that the ancestors didn't say these things. So they're not saying these things. They're not asking, where is God to come and deliver us? They're not even looking for God. Does that make sense? So just go through and look at the things in quotation marks. If you're a group person, you can work with the person next to you. If you hate group stuff and you're like, why do they make us do that? You can work by yourself. And I'm sorry if you're one or the other and you're sitting next to somebody who's the opposite. But just go through and take a few minutes and do that. And I just hope it will help you with Jeremiah and then also going into Ezekiel.